also, I was also interested in, I'm interested in creating an aesthetic experience as well as a sort of informational experience. And so sometimes documentaries, I love documentaries, but sometimes the aim of a documentary is primarily, to get the audience to take action or to make people more aware of an issue. And that was part of my interest, obviously, making people more aware of this history. But another part of it, is wanting to give people an aesthetic experience, in terms of how the cinematography is and how the music is. So it's not just about presenting information. So I kind of see it somewhere between documentary and fiction. There is a genre that I'm sure you're familiar with called docudrama. But when I think of that, I think of like a 1980s made for television movie. And docudrama has these conventions of, collapsing characters together and changing the facts to fit the story. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep the facts straight. And if I did invent something, I wanted to be pretty obvious what I had invented, so there was no confusion.
Well, so speaking of the facts, this film is obviously deeply rooted in the historical record. Just looking through the credits to see all of the archives that you consulted in making this. There's historical footage that's interspliced with your film. You pull heavily from Ford's own writings and his own ideas. So how did you make that decision to use the historical record so deeply in the film?
Mm-hmm. So part of it was philosophical and part of it was opportunistic. So I learned early on in my research that at one time, Henry Ford had one of the largest film studios in the world. He was kind of an early adopter of film. He sort of saw the potential for advertising and publicity. And, in the teens, he started a film studio housed right at Highland Park, and he started distributing these films through theaters and, running these kind of newsreels. And I knew that this particular archive was housed at the National Archives. It had been donated in 1963. And so that was partly a starting point for the film. It's just like starting to look through those archives and see what was there. The other part, is sort of what I alluded to before, is wanting to make that connection between the past and the present. And this idea of Ford being able to sort of travel from past to present, not only traveling in space, but also traveling in time, and are being able to make those conceptual leaps from one time to another. And also just kind of an interest. I always find these juxtapositions of, historical photographs of a place and then the place today so fascinating. And, I'm sure you're aware of like all the great stuff the Detroit Historical Society has, these photos of Detroit. And also just, where I live in Ann Arbor. So I just find that really interesting, that, seeing how places transform over time. And it kind of keeps with the theme of how, how these ideas transform over time, that they're always present, like the ruins of the ideas or the remnants of the ideas are still with us, but we might not recognize it because they've changed and into a different form.
So as the title suggests, the film is organized into these 10 different questions that this unseen interviewer is asking Henry Ford. And just to remind us all, I'm just going to read through these 10. Why are you still here? How would you describe your son, Edsel? How would you like to be remembered? Are you still a pacifist? Why did you become a publisher? But why did you hate Jews? Why did you humiliate Edsel? How did the working man's friend become the enemy of labor? Why did you keep Hitler's medal? And then finally, Mr. Ford, do you have any regrets? So to what extent, kind of in a broad overview, how and to what extent does Ford answer those questions in the course of the film?
Yeah, I think, maybe not all 10 of these questions, but a lot of them, the majority, are kind of questions that I have. Like if I were sitting here with Henry Ford, I might ask him these questions. And the answers that he gives are kind of my best guess about what the answers would be. And these are based on, newspaper interviews and the oral histories and so forth. And I kind of wanted to let him both, defend and incriminate himself without my editorializing about it. So, and I think he incriminates himself pretty well. He tries to defend himself. Yeah, so I mean, to what extent does he answer them? I mean, I think some of these are sort of unanswerable. And I think Ford was not, I mean, he certainly had, an inner life, but in many ways, he was kind of unreflective. So I don't know if he would ever even be able to answer these questions for himself.
So one of the central, maybe even the central concern of the film is Ford's relationship with his son Edsel,
Mm-hmm.
and the character, in fact, has spent his entire experience as a ghost searching for Edsel. And he says at the beginning of the film, quote, "I gotta think he's here somewhere. I keep thinking I've seen him, but it's only a mirage, some curlicue pattern in the brick, or sunlight sparkling on the rouge just the right way. Edsel and I don't always understand each other, but I gotta think he'd be looking for me too." So over the course of the film, Ford keeps thinking he's seen him. You have some very moving sequences with actual footage and photographs of Edsel Ford that are superimposed on walls of flaking paint or wooden doorways. And so at the very end, at Willow Run, Henry Ford believes he's actually finally seen Edsel, and he reaches out, he's on his knees, he's hugging him, and he's hugging the air, but it's clear that he's hugging a child. And it's an emotional scene, right? He pulls the child close, he sniffs his hair and hugs him, and then, clutches at his heart, realizes that he's not actually there, and so straightens his tie and stands up and then walks out of the scene. So I'm curious about the message there. And also, if you might speculate on why your character is not concerned that his wife isn't there at all, but his son is his preoccupation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I mean, before I answer it, I just want to mention, since you found this to be a powerful moment, and I also do, John Leppard, who plays Henry Ford, who does such a great job in the character, and also I think another reason that I find that scene very moving is Debbie Williams' choreography. So I mean, we've worked together before, and I just generally, like, I can't choreograph and I can barely block actors. But I can say to her, this is what I think is happening in the scene. I gave her some music, and then she came up with this great kind of movement sequence for him. So just want to give credit to those two. I think sometimes we destroy what we love. And I think that was the case with Henry and Edsel, and from reading some of the oral histories, there's one really touching oral history by Henry Ford's barber, where he describes Henry Ford coming in after Edsel died and showing him pictures of Edsel. Apparently Henry was bereft when Edsel died, and I'm not sure, but I suspect that he felt guilty. A lot of people were blaming him for Edsel's early demise. I don't know if that's entirely fair, but he certainly was pretty cruel to his son at times. And, even to the point of asking Harry Bennett, ironically enough, who was the Ford's enforcer and kind of anti-labor goon, if Harry thought that Henry had been cruel to Edsel. So, I don't know. Families are complicated. I guess that's the message. And sometimes we hurt the ones we love. As to why Clara isn't in that scene, I mean, I feel like from what I read that for Henry's relationship with Clara was resolved. There were no sort of unspoken things, but it was very unresolved with Edsel. So if I would imagine him as a ghost, I would imagine him, still trying to resolve that relationship. And I also had this kind of conception of the film that Henry was very alone, that he could see people couldn't see him. and he wouldn't really be able to connect with any of his, his other family. So that's kind of, partly it's the conceit of the film, but partly I think it's the descriptions of what the end of his life was like. Because he not only did he hurt Edsel, but he alienated a lot of his friends, and fired all his executives, and so it was a pretty sad, pretty tragic ending.
So let's talk about the conceptualization of the afterlife in your film. So Henry Ford says he's had 234 previous lives, but he seems to be, as you say, kind of stuck in this particular moment after his most recent life. He's a ghost, but he's still around. He talks about some people looking for him, the tourists looking for him. He's got a physicality to him. He can't walk through walls. He spends his time watching home movies. He complains about all the inefficiency that he sees around him. He chops down trees when he's really angry at his son. He goes through his checklist of the 13 locations where he's looking for Edsel. He rides public transportation, which is deeply ironic. We hear about his belief in spiritualism and reincarnation at the end of the film. So he's clearly stuck. And he's surprised that he's stuck. He says he thought by this point he'd be making Model Ts on Mars, or that he'd have come back as a chickadee. So he's stuck. And so why is he stuck? But also, what do you think is next for Ford? Is it possible, do you think, for there to be a kind of resolution here, or is he just going to be stuck?
I mean, maybe I'm a pessimist, but I'm afraid I think it's more of the same. I mean, Henry Ford had these, he believed in reincarnation, and he also believed in this idea of, it's kind of a fascist belief, basically, but that, all the sort of inequality that you see around you is a result of essentially karma, or that he as sort of a talented inventor and industrialist, he was that way because he had much life experience in previous lives, and he had brought all that experience with him. And his expectation is in his next phase, he would go even further, toward godliness or whatever. So I mean, I think it's kind of hysterical that the best he could imagine was that he'd be making Model Ts on Mars. But anyway, I guess that he's stuck is kind of my way of saying, I'm sorry, Henry, but I don't think you're gonna get any further until you resolve.
Yeah, there's no enlightenment there.
I don't think so. I mean, I've talked, a lot of people watched this film as I was making it, and there certainly were people who felt like there should be some kind of redemption or resolution, but I just, somehow I felt that would be dishonest, at least in terms of the way I see it.
So one of his options for reincarnation, as I mentioned, was he thought he might come back as a chickadee. And so one of the themes that I'm really curious about in your film is your use of birds. So Henry Ford seems to mark his life, his memories, his successes, his failures, his mystification, all of the stuff by birds. Birds saved, birds lost, particular family members that might be reincarnated as birds. Even the film's score incorporates birdsong motifs in really clever ways. So why birds?
So part of that is the biography. I mean, if you go to the Ford archives, and in fact, this is something I think you can see in the lobby of the Benson Ford archives, which, by the way, was really helpful to me. The librarians were very helpful. If you go in the lobby, you can see his something he wrote about his earliest memory, and it's of discovering a bird's nest, which you see in this recreation that he directed himself of discovering the bird's nest. It's his earliest memory. I think birds connect him to his childhood. They connect him to this sort of pastoral world that he grew up in and kind of helped destroy. He learned bird songs as a child. It's an interest that he shared with Edsel. There's a beautiful picture of the two of them sitting, with a telescope, bird watching in their bird watching regalia. I also think it kind of connects to, for someone who could be so who could be so ruthless at times, he also was extremely compassionate toward birds, you know, in a way that sometimes he wasn't toward humans. I know that's not so uncommon. Sometimes, you know, sometimes people are like that, even sociopaths. But you know, his Fairlane estate was and still is a kind of bird refuge. He had like 500 birdhouses. He was active in the early environmental movement. And so, you know, to me, that's sort of one of the best aspects of him. And so I wanted to show that, you know, there's a certain amount of villainy and, you know, just kind of idiocy and ignorance, but there's also, you know, a humanity in the character. And I think, to me, that's part of what makes him interesting. I mean, he's you know, his curiosity, his inventiveness, his creativity, all of those are really positive qualities. So I wanted to paint a full picture of him. I didn't want to make him, you know, into a total villain.
So, but let's talk about his villainy for a moment. So he justifies his anti-Semitism at the end of the film in really interesting ways. And this is after we've seen the headlines from the Dearborn Independent. We've seen sort of gestures toward the protocols of the Elders of Zion, et cetera. And then he comes at the end when he's asked, you know, but why did you hate Jews, and why did you accept Hitler's medal? And he says he doesn't hate anybody. He's simply helping the good ones recognize the bad ones. He had no idea of the horrors of the Holocaust. The US was neutral when he accepted Hitler's medal. It's not his responsibility to vet everyone who reads his book or displays his portrait. So what are you hoping that the audience will take away from those justifications? And also, how do you separate yourself from Henry Ford, the man, and Henry Ford, the character, in that kind of assessment?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think these kinds of statements or justifications are really common justifications for, you know, for prejudice. So you could easily imagine someone saying, I can't be prejudiced, I have lots of Black friends, or I can't be prejudiced, I have lots of Jewish friends. So, you know, that one is sort of a kind of standard thing. Another thing that we hear is, you know, you might say to someone of another race, well, I'm not prejudiced, or you might say, well, you're not like the other ones, you know, which is kind of also kind of damning. You know, I mean, I think we all have internalized prejudices. And I guess maybe one motivation is just like encouraging a sort of self-examination of Henry, but also of ourselves, including me. As far as, what was the second part of your question? I'm trying to remember.
Oh, I'm just going to say, Carolyn Normanden just chatted in microaggressions, exclamation.
Microaggressions. That's exactly what it is. And, you know, I mean, I can think of many things that I've said in my life that I wish I hadn't said, you know, that I think,
but you learned from those. Clearly, Henry Ford, your character, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was more interested in self-justification, and, you know, and I don't know if he ever realized the sort of enormity of what, you know, what his influence was on anti-Semites and particularly on the Nazis. And I don't know what he would have thought about it. You know, the scene toward the end of the movie where he describes seeing these films of a liberation of a concentration camp. That's based on a memoir by Josephine Goman, who was she was the sort of first female executive in the Ford Motor Company, and she was sort of the head of all the women who worked at the Willow Run bomber plant. You know, Rosie the Riveter and all of her colleagues. And she describes this incident of the Ford executives seeing this early film footage and of Henry Ford having a stroke. You know, and I thought, wow. You know, I mean, I don't know if that happened. That's the only account. Right. I wasn't able to corroborate it at all, but you know, you just kind of wonder, did he ever realize you know, what he had done, and did he have any regrets?
And so how do you separate yourself from those microaggressions of Henry Ford's there? I mean, you know, to what extent do you want your audience to sympathize with him? To what extent do you want them to, you know, condemn him? What sort of response are you looking for in those justifications?
I mean, I think I just want to kind of lay it out there. You know, I feel like that the myth of Henry Ford is so firmly established. And there's kind of a whole industry built around perpetuating that myth. And it's not just because of Henry Ford. I mean, it's because I think he's almost like a kind of Greek god. You know, he's a mythological figure that people sort of invest a lot of their values and ideas in. And he, you know, at one point in the one of the promotional films that I quote in the movie, or that I use a piece of, I can't remember the exact wording, but it's something like, you know, Henry Ford, he personified the American spirit of individualism and freedom of enterprise, right? And so I kind of want people to look at that. Like, what is, okay, that's Henry Ford, and like, what does that mean? This kind of extreme veneration of individualism and freedom of enterprise, sometimes at the expense of everything else. And yeah, so I guess I just want to, you know, I want to fill out the character, and I want people to be able to see him as he was, as well as I can approximate. And also, you know, maybe it's also, I mean, something I've been thinking a lot about as I've been making this movie, and just, you know, also kind of at the stage of life that I'm at, which is like, you know, what are the ramifications of your actions in your life? You know, what will survive you? I hope my legacy is better than Henry's in that way. I mean, you know, obviously he put the world on wheels, and he, you know, he was venerated not just in Nazi Germany, but, you know, all over the world, and even in Soviet Russia. You know, he brought tractors to the comrades, you know, so there was some level in which he, a lot of people revered him, and he is arguably was a force, you know, positive force, and we all drive cars, but that's obviously not the whole story. You know. Yeah,
well, let's talk about the rest of that story, and particularly the macro aggressions, as one commenter has put in the chat. Absolutely right. Let's talk about the legacies of those macro aggressions. So I'd like to invite our other two panelists to join the conversation, and while they're plugging in here, I will just give a quick little introduction about both of them. Carolyn Normanden is the Regional Director of ADL Michigan, where she focuses on combating anti-Semitism and other forms of hate through advocacy, community service, and anti-bias education. She's also held senior positions at GM and the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. So welcome, Carolyn. I know your experience in the auto industry, as well as your experience at the ADL, will be great for this conversation.
Thank you.
And then second, we've got Rabbi Lopatin, who is Executive Director of JCRC AJC. I don't know how you have time for all of your things that you are directing at the same time that you're doing JCRC and AJC, and the list is a mile long here. But so suffice it to say, you also are someone who is interested in advocacy and education, and giving the historical context for these issues like anti-Semitism that are so in the forefront of our experience now. So welcome to our new panelists, and let's talk about this film and about its resonances for us today.
Thank you so much for having us. I want to make one thing clear. It's hard for me to imagine that Henry Ford did not know what he was doing. And when I was talking about microaggressions, that's sort of the use of the justification of, I have all these Jewish friends, or I hire brilliant Jewish lawyers. Make no mistake, I think, especially recently, last week, there was the commemoration of the 100th year of the refutation of the protocols of the elders of Zion. In other words, 100 years ago, last week, that book was refuted as being a complete fake. And I think it can't be overstated what Henry Ford did, quote unquote, for the world in terms of the lasting impression that has been made by his reprinting the protocols, by his dissemination of all of the information that he disseminated through the Dearborn Independent. The Nazis imprinted the protocols, calling it, and they were here in the United States under, an American patriotic publishing company. Much of the Arab world continues to promulgate them. Just recently, we found out that the newly elected president of Iran had overseen a project in Iran to make films, 50 films about the protocols of the elders of Zion. And for those of you who might not have heard of that or don't know what it was a fictitious work, completely roundedly characterized 100 years ago as a complete fake. And the idea of the protocols is that greed and power were talked about by a group of Jewish influencers. And that became the idea that Jews would take over the world. And it was a mythological book. Most people think it was done by, Russian oligarchs, that were trying to find escape, Jews to blame. But the fact that there's still the playbook of extremists now, and you can find the rhetoric on any one of a number of sites, even right now, tonight, on dozens and dozens of sites all over the world. We can blame, in large measure, Henry Ford's influence. He used his power and he used his resources to be able to put the protocols of the elders of Zion into the hands of a gigantic American audience through the Dearborn Independent. And I want to say, Andy, I'm really glad you didn't manipulate history here, or that you didn't take a dramatization, because I think I did work for the car industry for many, many years. And I think I think you can separate out the good things of somebody, the things that they really do that really, really change the world, but completely understand that they have faults and weaknesses. And in this particular case, Henry Ford's thoughts about Jewish people, his really, really anti-Semitic verbiage can't be overstated. It just simply can't.
Oh, and so I echo Carolyn's passionate view, and I want to say that it's not just because Carolyn worked for a competitor to the Ford Motor Company. I wholly agree. Though I would say there's another side to this film, and it came out in discussion, that the human side, which I think reflects sometimes on anti-Semites. You mentioned it also, Andy, the self-destructive nature of anti-Semitism. I just saw that there is a doctor, a Lebanese doctor, who's not in Lebanon anymore, a Lebanese doctor who arranged for Palestinians from Lebanon to be able to get treatment in Israel. He was just sentenced to 10 years in prison in absentia because he was dealing with Israel. There's just this self-destructive nature sometimes of anti-Semitism that we saw in Ford. It wasn't particularly, he wasn't bitten because of his hatred of Jews, but the same hatred, the same, not willing to change the Model T Ford, and just really, and not listening to anything Etzel would say. So I think that there's this element of, in using Yiddish, it's like a nebuch anti-Semite sometimes. It's like almost, it's so frustrating. I mean, we're seeing it in other aspects also of irrational thinking. So that's one aspect. And I also think that one of the things that is a little bit redemptive in this film, but it's really so sad. It's an amazing film. Is Etzel? Is that Etzel? He is, I don't know, from what I read a little bit about Etzel, that he did have a more cosmopolitan connection, and it's pretty amazing that not only Etzel, but Etzel's son, Henry IV II, and people know that, you know, his work with Jewish philanthropists and also working with Israel now and currently, and that there's something to it that this person who was such a vicious anti-Semite, and everything Carolyn said is true, and really we're suffering now from the intolerance and from his viewpoint, not only Jews, but immigrants and anyone who will change the way, the perfect American image that he has, that yet he produced children and grandchildren who are so different and visionary. And so I think it is a fascinating story, and it's just such a sad story. Now you brought out, Andy, that sadness in it, and that's sort of, again, in the contemporary anti-Semitic world where sometimes there are even really good people, and that's the fact that Ford was a pacifist and hated war, so much goodness, you could still be a anti-Semite, you could still harm the world so much and not be necessarily all bad. But really, I think the film, that human aspect of the film really helps in seeing us almost a different image of an anti-Semite, which tragically is still so harmful.
One thing I just wanted to say also was, you know, Ford was not alone in his anti-Semitism in America in the 20s and 30s. I mean, I'm reading a book about a really good book about the second Klan. It's called The Second Coming of the Ku Klux Klan, and it talks about how, you know, millions of Americans in the Midwest were members of the Ku Klux Klan, and it was almost like, you know, they were very focused in the 20s on Catholics and Jews. Of course, they were anti-Black, as they always had been, but it was a different Klan from after the Civil War, and they were really focused on immigrants, Jews, Catholics. And this book is so fascinating because it's describing, you know, Klan picnics and, you know, Klan carnivals, and there's like this image of these people in, you know, Klan robes and hoods riding a Ferris wheel. And it makes me think about like how endemic anti-Semitism was, you know, in the Midwest, in America, and still is. So that, you know, Henry Ford was different because he had $1 billion and a printing press. but there are any number of people that if they had the same resources and the same sort of drive and obstinacy, could have done the same thing. So I don't want to make it into like, if only we hadn't had Henry Ford, you know, this wouldn't exist. I mean, it's the same with, you know, the sort of legacy of racism, you know, in America. It's not just a few bad racists. It's woven into the fabric of the country, into the history of it.
I think that's absolutely right, Andy. And, you know, I will say, I always agree with Asher. I don't know, we kind of have the same mindset all the time, but he joked about I'm not coming up against Henry Ford because I happen to work for General Motors. I think Asher and maybe Katie, maybe you've heard the story. The day before I started working at General Motors, my uncle called me up and said, Carolyn, don't tell anyone that you're Jewish. And I was young. I was so, why? Why would you think that? Why? And he said, the auto industry is a very anti-Semitic industry. So it wasn't just Henry Ford at Ford Motor Company, you know, the entire industry, and many, many places around the country, including, you know, the Midwest. I don't blame Henry Ford at all for inventing anti-Semitism. One of the things that I tell people all the time is several of the tropes, the blood libel, the disease, you know, hating Jews because of the death of Christ is 2,000 years old. This is not Henry Ford did not invent anti-Semitism. It often, and having worked for the auto industry for such a long time, I did see the value. The auto industry did put Detroit on the map. It's just the vast amount of resources and how he used them, and the distribution network that he had through his dealerships, where people in the Midwest, in the West, in the South, in the East, were getting this material in the dealerships.
Mhm.
Most of the time, when you make a purchase of a car, it's a very, very big purchase, second only to your home. So if you're going to a car dealer and you're trusting the dealer and you're picking up a magazine and you've never met a Jewish person and you're reading this virulent stuff about Jews, that's where I think the power of this distribution network harmed us. So I think you're absolutely right. We can't blame Henry Ford for anti-Semitism at all. I also think Rabbi Asher, the idea that people have redemptive value and the family tries. It's very clear. The history of the Ford family has tried. Ford Motor Company has tried to involve people of all races, and in fact, I'm a member of the Ford Multicultural Committee. It's a quarterly committee, and they definitely want Jewish people on that committee. So I think a lot of times, sometimes seeing somebody up close and seeing their foibles allows generations later to say, okay, this is what I can change about this picture. And so I think that's a very big positive.
So interestingly, Bill Ford gave a New York Times interview in December 2020, which you may have seen, when he's asked, in this moment of larger racial reckoning that the U.S. is having, what do you think about Henry Ford? I mean, is there a moment here for you and for Ford Motor Company to say, here is our history, and to take a stand and say no more? And Bill Ford's response was, well, do you apologize for everything your great-grandparents did? I certainly don't. That's a chapter in our past. It's over and done, never again. So, how do we translate this pressing contemporary issue for people like Bill Ford, who would say, it's over, it's done. I have no hand in it. Doesn't involve us.
I think we're seeing that, I think many of us thought American society has changed and everything is hunky-dory and, things can be put in our past. I remember seeing films or footage of the Klan in the 50s, and that, Eisenhower dealt with that, and that's been dealt with. And I guess we realize if you do that, it comes up again. And Andy did this film, in reaction to things that we're really seeing in the news, this hatred of the other, and this defense of the perfect American image, white, Christian, whatever it is, Protestant. So I think, if we just don't call these things out constantly and make it part of our history, we repeat it. It's so tragic that we repeat it.
Yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
I think that the sort of pretending it never happened or pretending it's done, I mean, it's the same thing, I think, with the legacy of slavery. I mean, you just have to tell the truth. You just have to look at it. And we just have to look at what's the legacy of anti-Semitism in the United States, and around the world. But I feel like we really haven't reckoned with that in a very deep way, and how deeply rooted it was, and how that is still fueling the sort of extreme right wing and the January 6th insurrection. I mean, there's all kinds of anti-Semitic tropes and symbols and so forth. I mean, one of the things that I found as I was researching this piece was I don't think I realized like how close we came to fascism before the Second World War. I mean, there were a lot of people who thought the answer to the Depression was fascism. And I think that probably was Henry Ford's idea. I mean, it's probably what he would have said. And there were even people who thought, that Roosevelt should become a dictator, that would be the best way to, move forward. And then you see like this footage of the German-American Bund having their rally in Madison Square Garden with 20,000 people. We were pretty close. And who knows what would have happened if Lindbergh had been elected, and like in the Philip Roth novel.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a little too close to comfort. And I think now with, just sort of the resurgence of these kind of neo-fascist movements and these extreme racist movements, we're realizing this is something deep in our past that's going to keep coming up.
I think, Katie, because you head up a historic organization, and the people that hope are probably participating in this evening are people who like to study history, who care about history. And I think Asher said it very well. The quote that those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. It's something we must continue to call out. It's something we must continue. I also agree with Andy. The answer is not to sweep it under the rug and say it never happened. The answer is to lay it on the table, name it, and then move on. Talk about it, and then see how you can change for the better. The obvious evolution of the world, And I think as Jews, we know that we always have to do a little better. It's one of the things that we do. We're coming up to the Jewish holidays. Yom Kippur is a way for us to reflect. It's something that we're called upon to do. And I don't mean to be so parochial. It's not only Jews do that. There are a lot of people that reflect on deeds that they've done and then move forward and try and make amends. So I think those are important things to think about.
Right, I really agree that not to be afraid of admitting these things. These are, yes, it's this kind of thinking influenced Hitler and 6 million Jews and how many other, in the Roman community and died and millions and millions. So it's a big one. Someone says it's not a microaggression, it's a macroaggression. But I guess you have to have that confidence, and exactly as Carolyn mentioned, in the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition of forgiveness, and the Muslim tradition has this also a Salha ceremony that, don't be afraid to admit even the most heinous things. And I was at the Henry Ford, the Rouge Ford factory tour with my father-in-law recently, and they mention a little bit, they touch on it a little bit in the film, and it's just the one thing I would say. It's just so paradoxical. It's just so. How do you combine someone who's contributed so much, especially to Detroit and Henry Ford health systems, and yet to do something so horrible? But you can't. The answer is not ignoring it. The answer is we're human beings. We can deal with it. We can admit it, and it's exactly as Carolyn said, that will enable us to really move on in the right direction.
So I'm going to bring in some of the questions that have come in on the Q&A feature, and to those in the audience, if you wish to submit a question, feel free to do so, and I will read these out. One that just came in says, I want to point out that inside Ford Motor Company, there is an explicit effort to be inclusive and sensitive.
Great.
Okay.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah.
So here's another question that's come in. Why did so many people listen to what Ford was saying? My guess is that people already believed these things and Ford brought it to the surface, similar to what's happening today.
I mean, I think it's a couple of things. I think one is Ford, so before the $5 day, he was just another automaker. This is before 1914. And then he became a celebrity. And he became a very wealthy celebrity, and people admired him. And he also, I think he discovered, maybe before anyone else, this idea of making a personality identical to a brand. I mean, now it's sort of like we're used to it, like it's Steve Jobs, it's Tesla, it's whatever. But he was sort of, as far as I know, the first one to realize the power of modern advertising, PR, film, radio, in kind of establishing this, this identity for himself and this kind of mythological presence. So I think he was a hero to many, many people. And there's even testimony in the Nuremberg trials of, I don't know how to pronounce his name. I think it's Baldwin von Schirach. He was the mayor of Vienna. And he says that he actually became anti-Semitic originally, not from hearing Hitler, but from hearing Ford. And it was because Ford was such a hero because of his sort of industrial methods and the wealth that he created and all the sort of mythology that he created around the $5 a day, that people just, he said, naturally, we believed him. It was Henry Ford. So that sort of combination of celebrity and public image, and it gave him this credibility.
He lifted a lot of people up. I will call upon my work at the Charles Wright Museum of African American History. Mm-hmm. There's an entire gallery devoted to Southern migration. Mm-hmm. Coming up from the South, Black Americans and Black community members coming up from the South to work in the auto industry and to make $5 a day. And his work lifted people out of poverty. This is a real thing. It wasn't just good for Detroit as a community. It gave people jobs. So I agree with you, Andy. He was a person that people revered because he allowed them to make a decent wage. $5 a day was a lot of money. And the idea that you could pay somebody enough to buy your product, brilliant marketing, tremendous foresight. So yeah, true.
So Andy, this is a question particularly for you. In his later life, when Henry Ford was most erratic, when he fired rooms full of Ford Motor Company accountants, the US government brought home his grandson, Henry Ford II, to run the nation's second biggest industrial company. So this was a man with a gigantic sense of narcissism. Like Trump, he lived for public adoration. Why didn't you portray his reaction to the general rejection of him in the late 1940s?
Yeah, good question. I think part of what happened in his later life, as best as I can understand it, is he was suffering from dementia. He had his first stroke in 1938. I think he had another big one in 41. And I really brought it up to sort of the time of Edsel's death. That's really the end of the film for me. He lived until 1947. I think in any film or any storytelling, you sort of have to define the boundaries of the film or the story that you're going to tell so that it doesn't become a sprawling mess. And there are many things that were, that in his life that I found really fascinating that I either had to cut or I realized I couldn't even put them in. I mean, even the trial, that forced Ford to finally issue an apology. I mean, it's very relevant, but on the particular storyline that I was dealing with, it didn't need to be there. And similarly, somebody asked about, this pretty well established idea that he fathered an illegitimate child by his mistress. It's interesting, but it didn't really belong in this particular story.
Can I just, Andy, did you find that there is a kind of a soft side to him? He was so cruel to Edsel, but he did compromise on unions. He did agree to open the factory, the producing the aircraft. He did give in on the Model A. Was there, and then I'm thinking that he didn't have the Fabrenta, like fully, vicious anti-Semitism that we saw in Germany elsewhere. He did have Jewish workers, right? He didn't exclude Jews from working. I don't know how high up they got, as Carolyn mentioned, for any car company, but was there that kind of, he did bend a little bit, or maybe not? Maybe that's not a good interpretation.
I think he did. I mean, somebody put in the comments something I would agree with, that, you know, I think Clara Ford had a big influence on him. I mean, when the strike, you know, when he finally gave in to creating a union in 1941, I mean, it came as a complete shock to everybody because he was dug in and dug in. And Ford's own explanation was it was because of Clara. I think it was also because of Edsel. You know, I think the whole battle over the transition to the Model A, I think that was largely Edsel. I think, you know, the union, as Harry Bennett said, Harry Bennett didn't think that Ford would have ever given into the union if it hadn't been for Edsel. So I think there were people sort of speaking to his better angels, and you know, and I think in some cases they won the battles, and you know, he was very attached to his family. It was a very close family, and that was part of how painful it was. You know, that he was very close to Edsel when Edsel was a child, and even into adulthood. But you know, they kind of grew apart in their lives and their social circles and their interests and their sort of beliefs about things. And so you have this family that's like, you know, they love each other and they hate each other at the same time. Or, you know, they're locked in struggle. So, but I think ultimately the family had a lot to do with it.
So speaking of family, there are a couple of questions in the chat about the Ford family and to what extent they know about your film. Andy, have they reached out to you? Have you reached out to them?
I haven't explicitly. I would love to. I mean, I'd love to, you know, I kind of feel like, I mean, you know, I know when it's your family, it's personal, right? I mean, it's a lot easier for me to, you know, explore what I think is the truth about Henry Ford than it would be for me to explore the truth of my grandfather, if there were similar transgressions. But I would love to, you know, work with the Ford family. I mean, I think that it'd be great to, you know, really kind of spread this more complete picture of Henry. And also, I feel like Edsel deserves like a little recognition. You know, he's so obscured in history. Most people, I mean, literally most people just associate him with the failed car, which he had nothing to do with. And he did a lot of good things for Detroit and, you know, for the company. And so, yeah, I haven't had any contact with them though. Yeah.
I also wanted, somebody else brought this up in the chat, but Ford had a lot of alliances with Jewish people during his heyday. I mean, he worked with Albert Kahn. He worked with a lot of, it's not that he was, I have never read that he was outwardly aggressive towards Jewish people at all. My beef is his distribution of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And in using the Dearborn Independent the way he did. But I think he had a lot of relationships with Jewish architects, Jewish attorneys. Certainly I think one of his first finance people was Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, I think eventually a lot of them became estranged from him, like Albert Kahn, you know, wouldn't see him after a certain point and sent his brother.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think his anti-Semitism, you know, and this is something that I think you would probably agree is true of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's a conspiracy theory. You know, it's this belief that there are these secret forces sort of manipulating, you know, society and everything you see around you. And I think he believed in the conspiracy theory, and he probably really believed that he was doing Jews a favor by revealing this, you know, this alleged conspiracy theory. And maybe he saw no contradiction between being friends with Leo Franklin or with Albert Kahn and perpetuating this totally crackpot conspiracy theory about international bankers and, you know, the plot for world domination.
Well, and it was not too far after the protocols were initially published. Well, it's 30 years probably, I think, but certainly it was, he could have believed it. You know, conspiracy theories are problematic. You can't really refute them with facts, because the whole idea of a conspiracy theory is that it's secretive and it's under, you know, under the guise of, I mean, we see that now with QAnon and things like that.
So here's a question for all four of us. We all believe in a reckoning regarding all aspects of discrimination writ large. The real question is how. We who believe in it are talking to each other, not to those who need it.
You know, I'll jump in on this because the JCRC, AJC, we have a lot of alliances, and while our partnerships are with usually people, amazing people that are, have not, a bone of hatred in their body, but they're connected with people that, do have, beliefs that are maybe closer anti-Semitism and or certain other types of hatred or conspiracy theories. So I think the more we reach out, the closest circle around us outside of our community will be really great, nice people. But then you move out, and I'll give an example also with anti-Zionism. There are people that are really wonderful that don't believe in the state of Israel, and I don't think they would be, you can classify them as anti-Zionist, as anti-Semites, but then there are people that are very close to them that hate Jews and hate Israel and do qualify as anti-Semites. So I think we can touch, and maybe we can have some influence on those people through the intermediaries. So I think as we reach out, we are going to connect a little bit. And I draw so much inspiration that the truth is, it was Etzel's group that he hung out with. It was Max Fisher and Henry Ford II and their wives that connected, gave him a different understanding. And so I do have hope that you can break down some of that that idea of a conspiracy theory. There are all these stories of white supremacists who are in college and they're invited to a Friday night dinner, a Shabbat dinner, and they see the Jews are kind of normal people. So I do believe if you reach out, we can go beyond the choir.
I think that's true. You educate people by being with people, by standing up in quiet ways and in loud ways. Sometimes you have to shout it from the rooftops, and sometimes you have to pull somebody aside and break bread with them. In my view, it's education and bringing people under the tent to be able to advance the world. And this is something that, you would think by 2021 we would have gotten our act together on this, but I think this is an ongoing thing. I think, to Andy's point, anti-Semitism at its core is xenophobia. It's fear of the other. And when people are fearful, they look for people to blame. And when you look for people to blame, there's been, somebody, I think in the chat, talked about anti-Semitism being the oldest form of hatred. It is. It's 2,000 plus years old. Whether it's not liking Jewish person because they won't bow down to an idol, or not liking a Jewish person because they wear different clothes or whatever. Fear of the other. Whenever you're fearful of something, you try and scapegoat them or you try and blame them. So I think it's education. It's doing programs like this. It's telling one person who tells another who tells another.
So another question that's come in: to what extent was Henry Ford's anti-Semitic writing his own, and to what extent was it Cameron and Leibold's work?
Mm-hmm. I mean, so this is a really interesting question because it was sort of the subject of a lawsuit, right? So in 1927, around about that, Aaron Shapiro sued Henry Ford for libel, and because of what Ford had printed about him, about Aaron Shapiro, who was a farm organizer, what Ford had printed about him in the Dearborn Independent. And Ford, ultimately, his defense was he knew nothing about these articles. He never read the paper. How could he know? It was all other people's work. And Cameron, who was a a very skilled journalist, if maybe a little overly florid, he kind of went along with it and said, yeah, Ford knew nothing about it. Anyway, it's pretty hard to believe. But Ford was not a writer. I mean, he was, he went to maybe the 8th grade, in a farm community. If you look at his notebooks, I mean, he's really barely literate. So he clearly did not write any of it. He didn't write any of his autobiographies or any of that. But I have to believe he was behind it. I don't know if he understood like all the sort of like intricacies of Cameron's explanation of the situation of Germany and Russian monarchy and all of that kind of stuff. I have a feeling he understood nothing about that kind of world history that Cameron was publishing, but he certainly went along with it, and he's certainly the one who made it possible.
And he didn't even write his own apologies for that matter.
Right. I mean, the irony is that, right, Lewis Marshall, speaking of the AJC, I mean, Lewis Marshall is the one who wrote the apology, and Ford didn't even look at it. It just said, sign it. And apparently Harry Bennett is the one who forged the signature. So it's just, yeah.
Yeah, which then allowed Henry Ford to say, as he did later, I didn't write this.
Right.
I certainly didn't sign it. Which was technically true. Although, as Ernest Liebold said when he was not on the stand after the last trial was over, if Mr. Ford wanted it done, it was done. So in particular regard to his treatment of Jewish people, that he wanted it done, and so we did it for him.
Someone mentioned the book, The People's Tycoon, in the chat. That's if you're looking for a good biography of Ford, it's a really great one. Covers the things that we've been talking about, but just the sort of whole picture. And also there's a book called Henry Ford and the Jews. There's actually 2 called Henry Ford and the Jews. But the most recent one, and I'm blanking on the author's name right at the moment. It's called Henry Ford and the Jews, The Mass Production of Hate. That's a really good book. I mean, really, really worth reading.
So here's another question that's come in. The International Jew was not just a relic of an ever-distant past. Until recently, dozens of editions were listed on Amazon, with thousands of the most blatant affirmative reviews and comments. Amazon began a policy of removing these listings and comments a couple of years ago, raising First Amendment issues, but it's still widely available online with lots of admiring comments. No copyright exists and anyone can reprint it. And I will say you can still find it on Amazon if you search deeply enough. So responses to the International Jew.
I just want to make mention that if you see something sold on Amazon or on any of these digital platforms, you can complain to the digital platform, and I suggest you do it. You could also fill out an incident report to the ADL, but we work back channels in terms of the online, and it doesn't matter if it's a book or swastika earrings or Ku Klux Klan masks, any type of material. All of these digital companies are trying to get their arms around what they sell and how they police it. And ADL has a really good resource about on how to complain about online hate. Basically, you go to each platform's online complaint tool and you make a report. And then if you make a report to ADL, we also add our 2 cents in. These things pop up like popcorn. They're all over the place. You have to call them out. You have to, take umbrage with them. It took 11 years for Facebook to take Holocaust deniers off of that platform. This only works when all of us with the buying power make complaints, because that's what moves the needle on stuff like that. So I would just say that would be one thing I would say to anybody listening. Complain to the platform, whether it's sales on Amazon or whether it's content that you see on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or any of those.
Andy, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, after you.
Well, I would just compliment what first of all, compliment Carolyn for her work and compliment what she's saying with like, don't let this there's a viciousness out there slow us down, like in creating relations with the African American community, the Muslim community, the Hindu community, all the Catholic community, every community out there, and for doing good. And really, I think that the worst thing that anti-Semitism could, there have been violent crimes and terrible things, but one of the worst things is to, push Jews to just look inwards and be disheartened by the relationships that you can create. Even, in the African American community, there have been issues with Black Lives Matter and certainly the organization, the Women's March, lots of issues. But we just can't let that slow us down. We have to fight it, as Carolyn is and call it out, as Carolyn is saying. And we have to be the Jews and any minority that is they're trying to beat us down or trying to quiet us. We got to be louder in doing the great things that all the different minorities that people want to exclude from America have contributed to this country and the world.
So Andy, I'll give you the final word before we close it out. Anything you'd like to add?
I'm sure I'll think of a million things I forgot to say, but I just have enjoyed this conversation so much. I just want to thank Carolyn and Rabbi Lopatin and you, Katie, and all the people who helped make this event happen. Kara, who sent out all the messages, and Risha. Yeah, I just thank you for the opportunity to share the movie, and I'll just say, for anyone who wants to continue the conversation or wants to let me know anything that they wanted to say that they weren't able to say, you can email me, andy@henryfordquestions.com. And it's such an early stage of the movie that it's really useful for me to hear what people's responses were, things that confused them, things they liked, things they didn't like. So feel free to, write me and tell your friends.
Yeah, so tell your friends. Don't forget the streaming window will stay open until Sunday night, so you have a chance to watch it again, tell your friends and loved ones to watch it. And Andy, will you keep us posted on the film's premiere as we go forward, since we all got this lovely sneak peek? Will you keep us apprised?
I will. I was telling Katie earlier that I'm still waiting to hear from some film festivals, and so there's this sort of whole issue of film festivals wanting to have the public premiere. So I don't have any word on any of that yet, but I will let you know as soon as we decide on where and when it's going to premiere. I mean, we'll certainly, regardless, have some kind of premiere in the Detroit area, so I'll let you know. And hopefully we'll be able to see each other in person at some point.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Thanks for making the film, Andy. Thank you very much.
Amazing.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure. Yeah.
And I nudged Risha to put her video on so we could see her. So thank you.
Thanks to the team at the Historical Society.
Yeah.
Jewish Historical Society.
You've been great to work with.
Our pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Hope you enjoyed the film and the discussion. We'll see you next time. Bye.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.